Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Room Live. History Room Live is a program of the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room at Patent Free Library. Today, we are joined by local historian Marla Davis, who has previously spoken at the library on several topics related to her interest area of public health. Back in 2005, she was actually in the first class of Town History Series speakers with her talk on Granny Lombard. And her most recent talk, as many of you know, was a history of the 1918 flu epidemic in the Bath area. Today, she will be speaking about her research on the Tinney and Price families, two of Bath's better-known African-American families. As Marla will explain, her research began as part of the library's Black History Month teach-in and read-in earlier this year. I'm very pleased to welcome her here today. Marla, take it away.
Thank you so much. I am standing in the community room with no faces to look at. So Jill, I'll have to look at yours. But welcome everyone, and thanks for your interest in this topic. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to a new resource in the history room. It's a collection of information on the Tinney-Price family, a Black family that lived in Bath for over a century. The idea came, as Jill just noted, from a discussion we had prior to Black History Month, and there seemed to be some interest in who were the Tinneys, who were the Prices, were they related? I knew the family growing up in the Bath neighborhood, so I immediately grabbed a hold of this idea. And it turns out that my mother was one of the Cub Scout masters for Barry Price, and my mother was also a 1945 classmate of Maxine Price. So I do have some semi-familial connections. It seems to me that the special theme for this family, which is expressed in this first slide that you see here, is contribution to community and country. And I will share their contributions and also their unfortunate tragedies. This project was a group effort, and I really want to thank Joe Minot, who searched the Bath City directories, and Carrie Nelson, who searched the newspapers. I used my fledgling skills at genealogy to search Ancestry.com and found many birth, death, and marriage records. And near the end of my research, I found that I could use the Portland City directories, which were electronically available. So it answered a lot of lingering questions. Another source that I ran into that I would highly recommend is a book that we have in the history room, and it's titled Maine's Visual Black History by Price and Talbot. It helps to describe the history of Black families in our region generally. A number of people shared their knowledge and recollections with me, and I will thank them at the end. Also, family members generously shared information and photographs which greatly enrich the resource. It's really going to be fun to show you those. In addition to ancestry records going back to 1849, the report consists of slides that tell, as best we can, of the Tinney-Price family. As I'm sure you all know from your experience, projects like this are really two stories. The one you set out to discover, that is about the family, and also the story of how you made those discoveries. Both have been highly satisfying, especially knowing that the history room now has a record of this remarkable family. I used PowerPoint to organize the information, but there's really too much on these slides to try to read. So just sit back and I'll tell you the stories. And now that the history room is open by appointment, I understand, you can stop by and see this resource for yourself. And so Jill, please give me a heads up so that I can finish in time for our 15-minute Q&A. Thank you. Well, let's start with a geography lesson. This you may recognize as the West Indies. The most distant relative of the Tinney family that we found dated back to 1849. This is Albert, who was born in Demerara. And I don't know about you, but I had never heard of Demerara. It turns out that it is a big river valley in modern-day Guyana, also known as British Guyana. And it's there in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. The big thing in Demerara was sugar. And if you go due east from this tip of southern or northern tip of South America, you run right into West Africa. The family revealed to me that they are of Nigerian descent. So here was Albert Tinney in South America. And starting around 1650, the Dutch began the importation of enslaved Africans. Between 1833 and 1838, the British outlawed importation of slaves. So Albert, born in 1849, was actually born a free man. Well, Albert married Martha Matthews, who was also born in 1849, but a long way away in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. They had 3 living children from what the census tells us were 13 pregnancies. And they were born, I've told you where they were born, but they did live in Portland. And the directories, which were so helpful, determined that Albert was actually a seaman or a mariner or a steward. So he worked on the water. And Price and Talbot tell us that Black people did come to Maine from the West Indies via shipping. And so he could have made his way here as a seaman. But this is, I think I skipped something, so hold on. No, that's right. Now, Martha, to get back to her, our Nova Scotian, we will see a picture of her as a younger woman in a moment, but I wanted to show you this Evergreen Cemetery in Portland. If you've never been there, I'd highly recommend it. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And we were able to locate a lot that Albert Tinney had bought. And it turns out that it's this rather bare place that you see in the first slide. And in the middle is this one lone monument to Catherine. Well, it turns out that Catherine was their firstborn, but she died at 8 months. And the records note that her death was from strangulation. In the day, that would have probably meant she choked on something or she died of sudden infant death syndrome. One might expect to find Albert here, and actually he was the person who purchased this lot, but he was not here, which further convinces me that he must have died at sea. The first 3 living children of George and Martha was Albert, excuse me. Albert and Martha was George Sr. He married another Martha, which made it pretty confusing doing this research. But he was born in Durham, Maine. So they had already made their way away from Portland or out of Portland, or this was before Portland. It's hard to know for sure. But Martha and George were married in Bath in 1916. She was from Haverhill, Mass, and a pretty large family. George George was a senior, so again, there's a lot of confusion between the generations. But let me show you the picture of Martha Jones, her name was, or her family. And she had many brothers and sisters, and this photo was a courtesy of the family. Now, George Tinney, this is George Tinney Jr., with Martha, and probably with their firstborn, George Jr. This picture projects in my mind a really big personality. And also, he was quite the entrepreneur. George was what was called in the day a bootblack. I had never heard that term, but it obviously, it seemed obvious afterwards. He was a shoe shine man. He came to Bath in 1902, and he was here the rest of his life. I know it seems odd to have a spreadsheet, but this was the way that I helped to organize the information that Joe found in the directories, and also various census information that I was able to find. This combines both of those and helps to locate George and Martha and their whereabouts in Bath. For reference, their 735 Middle Street would be just behind where the post office is now. I have to thank my husband for driving me around to all these locations, which have changed considerably since George Tinney was in town. Over 34 years, George worked in this business of shoe shining, and it became shoe repair after a while. He worked for others, and he also started his own businesses. And my guess is he was quite well known around Bath. In the 20s, when the new City Hall was planned, he was displaced, and that's how he ended up on Water Street in 1928. Here's the same information on a map. The two stars are locations where he lived, they lived. But all of his business addresses occur in that oval in the middle. So you can imagine, after all those years and in this close proximity, that we should be able to find a picture, but we have dug and dug, and there is no picture of his business. But what we do have are some ads from the city directory, and they show both a modern shoe repair, which is a business that he worked for, and also his own George A. Tinney Shoe Repairing. And it was at short notice. Satisfaction guaranteed, shoes look like new. He was on at least 4 occasions featured in the local newspaper. He was an oil painter, and economically, he thrived on 1 meal a day, according to this article. The Bath Independent article on the right mentions a painter's name who George enjoyed copying. His name was Gibson. I could not find any information on him, but also, he had the nickname Professor and was a boxing promoter. In 1928, George bought a building, moved it to Water Street, but unfortunately, 1928 and the following years were not good. They were not good for George, and they really weren't good for many people. And no one could afford to have their shoes taken care of. The family told me that things didn't go well for George after that. His business failed and his health failed. And in 1936, he died of heart failure. I thought I would show you this primary document because it was very helpful. First of all, it secured in my mind that who his father was, who his grandfather was Alexander, the father of Albert. So there it is, George A. A stands for Alexander. But the wrong name ended up both in his obituary, this is the name of his father, both in his obituary and on this document. It says Alfred, but as we know, it was Albert. And then Dr. Winchenbach was the coroner at the time. And that was interesting because we all, or many of us, knew Dr. Wink, but his name came up when Brenda did her program. Was it last program or the program before? Trying to identify some men in a picture, and one of them was Dr. Wink. The first burial in the family plot, and the family plot is at Oak Grove Avenue. I'm not sure if you can see that. It's on the side of Oak Grove near the Old Bath Road on the trail that goes through there. Just the side of the bridge. You can see there the family monument that says Tinney, and then in the ground is this brick size memorial to George, and it just says Daddy. I'd like you to meet the firstborn of George and Martha, and this is George Jr. George was the president of his Morse High School class of 1940 and was very involved in school activities, as you can see there, greatly admired and respected in the community, and a very accomplished musician. He played the saxophone and had his own band. He played at Bowden dances and all around town. And the tragedy with George Jr. is that he was in an automobile accident in May of 1940, coming back from a dance in South Bristol. And the whole band was in the car, and George was in the back seat, and he did not live. He had probably head trauma that caused a lot of bleeding. Here now, George Jr. has his brick in the same lot, and it's really poignant reading the information about his funeral service and all the people that were there. He was obviously very beloved around town. I'm not sure when this picture was taken, but logically it was after George Jr.'s death. And to the right is Martha, and these are the four remaining children: Maxine, Rosamond, Bill, and Audrey, and then Martha sitting. They were living at the time on Libby Court and stayed there until the mid-40s. And then Martha, now grandmother Martha, had moved into this house on Edward Street, and they all ended up there after the daughter Maxine, who is the young woman all the way to the left, later lived in the house with her teenage family. Martha, living on Edward Street, got a very convenient job helping Mrs. Sewell down on the other corner, the corner of Washington and Edward Street. This is a picture of the Sewell family around 1941. This was a card from Christmas during Sumner Sewell's tenure as the governor of Maine. And it was really fun talking with young Nick Sewell, who is the boy in the lighter suit. He remembered Martha and what a kind person she was. And he enjoyed telling me his stories. And Martha is the third person in the Tinney lot. She died at age 70, and that was in 1958, and had been in the local nursing home in failing health for a short amount of time before then. I want to go back here and show you the young boy in the middle. This is William, locally known as Bill. I want to tell you about Bill. He was quite well known in Bath, and he had been born while the family was living on Libby Court. As a freshman, he was elected president of his class. This was the class of 1945. But the tragedy with Bill is that he had to leave school. Imagine that the father had died, the oldest brother had died, and there he was, the one person who was able to help the family economically. So he went to work. He worked at Rogers Hardware. He worked at BIW. And in 1948, he joined the Marine Corps. And as you can see here, he was highly decorated. He aspired to the highest rating for a non-commissioned officer. Bill married Marguerite and loved coming back home to Bath, and Bath loved having him come home because every time he did, or anytime he made an advancement, the newspaper shared the word. And he was most proud, his daughter said, of the fact that he actually did complete his high school diploma in 1951. So you can imagine a very well-liked, a leader in his class, having to leave school and go out into the community to work. And yet he still managed to succeed. And there's a great deal of pride in his family about that. Yes, more notations about Bill Tinney and his wife coming to visit his sister and living in Hawaii. It was great to read all the articles about him, especially since he was a friend of my mother's. When Bill died in 2013, he was buried at Arlington along with his infant son, William Kevin. And this is his daughter, Lorna, and her husband, and their 3 children and their grandchildren. Lorna was one of the helpful people in putting this presentation together and who provided many of the photographs. So now I want to tell you about Maxine. Maxine was in the class of Morse 1945. She was married to this wonderful looking man, Nath, in the late 40s. And they lived in Bath. And then in 1953, they were divorced, and Maxine, being very ingenious, decided what she was going to do, and she went off to Bailey Evening School and took several different courses in secretarial skills, including shorthand and typing. And she ended up going to work at Parkview and also at BIW and supervisor of ships. Maxine was really well known in Bath because she was very pleasant. She was around town quite a bit. She walked a lot. She never owned a car. In fact, you would see her walking at 4:30 up Washington Street home, sometimes with a bag from the grocery store. So she was the last living Tinney-Price in Bath. I did want to note that she was a lifelong member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and saw to it that her children were all educated there. Maxine died in 2018, having gone the previous year to Georgia to live with her son, Barry. When the 50th reunion of the class of 45 occurred, Bill came home and Maxine was here. And you can see them in these photographs. In the center photograph, I really love this one. Maxine is standing next to my mom. So they both remain true to their class of 1945. And Bill, even though he had left and done his GED, he still considered himself a member of the class and came home for their reunions. Now, Maxine had 3 children, and I want to tell you about Dwight. Dwight was born in 1945, and he entered the Marine Corps right out of high school. He, unfortunately, was the first Bath boy to die in Vietnam. And he, too, is buried in the Tinney plot at Oak Grove with George Sr. and George Jr. Tom Jones took this woeful picture at Dwight's burial. Maxine, you can see in the middle, and then Barry and his sister Dale Ann are to Maxine's sides. This was from the Times Record, July 1st, 1968. Dale Ann was the youngest of Maxine's 3 children. She was born in 1948 and went to the Dyke School for a little bit and then on to the Adventist School. She was a widow with 4 children and 10 grandchildren when in February of 2013, a propane tank exploded at her home in Hyde Park and she died. I feel badly that while I knew that this emergency had happened, I didn't know until after the fact that it was Dale Ann Price. And then the middle brother is Barry. He was born in 46. I mentioned earlier that he was a Cub Scout and he delivered neighborhoods around, newspapers around the neighborhood of Beacon Street and Edward Street. He went from high school into the Marines as a paratrooper and feels very fortunate to have come home. After getting out of the Marines, after a short stint, he spent 30 years in law enforcement in Georgia and is now retired. These are some pictures of Barry as a youth. In the middle picture, both Barry and Dwight are in. I think it's a Seventh-day Adventist school photograph. And then the other photograph is of Barry. He came home to be a guest sheriff for a day in 1985 and did a ride-along with his friend, Jim Munsey. And Barry and his wife, Marjorie, live in Georgia and are proud to have a number of children, and also the first college graduate in their family on the far right-hand side of the screen. So that is all I have learned about the Tinney-Price family. Well, not all. There's more, and you can see it in the resource when you come by the history room. But I want to particularly thank these people who helped very much in gathering this information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marla. Wonderful presentation.